and they're part of Italy. They were one of the poorest provinces of all of Italy. Now they're the wealthiest, and much of that is because of agriculture, and also associated with that is the tourism that's been developed over the years. So just to give you a little more context. So when you're looking here, what you're actually seeing is the early stages of the apple harvest and what was beginning to happen there. And the South Tyroleans were incredibly smart, and they pulled together these farmer cooperatives. And this was starting back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And interestingly enough, these cooperatives became so successful that they also became very powerful political forces, which is also part of the story and the way in which they contribute here. But I think it's important to see that, even at this point, they were already producing apples. This is back in the 1930s, already producing apples for the local market, and then also beginning to build a reputation that was going to grow in terms of apple production in the area. And this also, if I were working in the vineyard there at Brunenburg Castle and I were to throw a stone downhill, I would almost have hit these folks right down below. This is in the 1930s. This is utilizing pesticides at that point in time. And we typically tend to think of pesticides as a modern phenomenon. Part of the way the story gets told very often is that they really amplified after World War II. And that is, in fact, the case. They did amplify because we were able to use so many of the different chemicals that were utilized in World War II, defoliants being one, various insecticides. But they actually go further back. And it's kind of an interesting thing when you look at fruit production and vineyards in particular, because what happened was in Europe, they were very taken in the late 1700s, early 1800s, very taken by the different kinds of grapes that they found in the United States and the different taste and the wines that they made. And Thomas Jefferson and others were very prominent in this whole move. So they actually took some of the vines from the United States. They took them to Europe, and unknowingly, when they did that, they also took two fungal diseases and then also a louse, the Rabe louse, as it's called in German, or the vine lice, phylloxera is the Latin name for that. So they took those three things with them. And it took a long time. It didn't take long for those two fungal diseases to spread, and it didn't take long for the vine lice to spread, but it took a long time to figure out what was going on. So finally, the Europeans started to realize that their vineyards were dying, and they were getting hammered, and they couldn't figure out what it was. Eventually, they figured out that there were the phylloxera, the vine lice that were in the soil, that were underneath, that were killing them, and they started to figure out the two primary diseases that the vines were having, the fungal diseases, and as a result, they started with what you might even these days hear referred to as the Bordeaux mixture, which is basically copper and sulfur. And so this mixture of copper and sulfur, that wasn't the first pesticide necessarily, but it was one of the most widely used. And so it was used in Europe. Then we also brought it back to the United States. And fairly effective in some cases for some of the fungal diseases, but that's primarily what was sprayed. Unfortunately, at one point, arsenic was also in the arsenal, which is a little bit ironic. So pesticides have a long history, and I should also say that when you look at cultures like India, there are pesticides there that are organic, that have been used for millennia, that are naturally occurring. And so I think we need to remember that actually these things have a much longer history than we generally talk about. And in this case, what they were spraying for, I'm pretty sure this is probably a petroleum distillate, probably a white oil, Weissöl as it's called in German, and against the tree lice in that particular case. So the small village that I've been going to since 1983, it used to be a very diverse agricultural village. These days, as you walk around, this is almost all of what you see. These are the apples, and we're here just outside of Big Apple. This is Big Apple in the Tyrolean version. And, it is just amazing what's happened in terms of the transition of the landscape. And obviously, with that comes the use of a lot of pesticides. So this is what things look like. The Tyroleans, as I said, the cooperatives were just incredibly smart as they were thinking about how can we actually really start to market apples, make a good profit for the farmers. And so one of the things that they discovered was in 1973, the Dutch were doing a really fantastic job with here what they call the slender tree trellis system. So that is, and you'll see this more and more in the United States, this is something that you start to see quite a bit actually in upper New York State, starting to see it in Vermont, some certainly seeing it in Washington State. And the idea here is that you try to grow the tree, you use a dwarf or a semi-dwarf rootstock, so you actually keep it so it's not going to be too high. When you're able to do this, instead of having the full size or the standard trees, it's actually of some benefit because you can do everything easier. You can certainly do the pruning easier. It's easier to do the irrigation, as you can see here that's set up. It's easier to do the spraying. In theory, at least what's touted is you use fewer pesticides because you're not having to spray into this really deep vegetation in order to try to penetrate to the middle of the tree. So there are some advantages to it, and certainly the harvest itself becomes somewhat easier. Part and parcel of that these days is also putting what you see here on top. These are the hail nets. And the hail nets are actually, they literally are an insurance, but they also mean that the farmers don't necessarily have to buy crop insurance. Instead, they invest in these hail nets. So the hail nets protect against, very volatile, climate that you have there, especially with climate change right now in the Alps. But they also protect against some of the birds that are coming in. They also obviously trap some of the birds. And then also they protect against sun scald, which is something that's very important here. So this is what it starts to look like. And this is sort of the corn and soy equivalent, if you will, of the South Tyrol. This is what happens when Big Apple rolls in, and this is what it starts to look like. This is the first information artwork that I'm going to show you here by Douglas Gayton and the Lexicon of Sustainability. And I want to make a couple of comments on that. Part of what we were trying to do is we were trying to figure out how to tell the story was trying to figure out who we could actually capture to convey some of the personalities that create a movement. What do those people look like? And so one of the things that Douglas thought would be fun, since Germans do it all the time, is we would start to make up words and smush them together, essentially. And so the German words that you see here on these different information artworks, as Douglas calls them, they're actually, they are real German words, but we did the compounding and the compositing, and in many cases we did that to show how ludicrous some of the scenarios were that people were actually dealing with. So in this case, what we were trying to convey was, what does Big Apple look like in the South Tyrol? And what's rather astounding is that in the South Tyrol, so a hectare is about 2.5 acres. And on 1 hectare, a farmer can not gross, but a farmer can net between 25,000 and 40,000 euros. And so right now the euro, I think, is at about $1.10, and sometimes it's $1.40. So you start to think about 2.5 acres and being able to actually net $25,000 to $40,000. And many of these farmers, they have smaller parcels because of the inheritance practices here over the years. They have the smaller parcels, but usually they've got, the average apple farmer is 4 to 6 acres here in this particular region. So they're making really good money. And they also get to put that away tax-free because there's a progressive tax policy in Italy which allows them to do so. So essentially what started to happen was the apple farmers started to become wealthier than any of the other farmers in the region. And that's part of the story, and in a sense, the land grabbing is a part of the story because all of a sudden you have these very wealthy farmers who are looking at the potential of being able to grow their apple crop, actually grow their productive capacity, and so they start looking for places where there are no apples. And where are there no apples? There are fewer apples as you start to go up into higher elevations, but what are we dealing with these days? We're dealing with climate change and a warming climate. So all of a sudden, the places where you could not grow apples, you can grow apples. And the Finchgau Valley that I showed you there on the map, that's prime apple territory. 300 days of sunshine, ample water coming in from all of the glaciers and the snow melt from all sides. Just an incredible place to put apples. But with that comes a cost, and that cost is that the apple growers wanted perfect cosmetic apples. So if you're traveling in Europe right now and you buy an apple, there's a 1 in 7 chance that it came from the South Tyrol because they've become so famous for these beautiful, magnificent apples that they are so careful with in the harvest. But part of that means that they also are using a number of different pesticides in the process in order to maintain that cosmetic beauty. And so as a result, right now, it's the highest use of pesticides anywhere in Italy. at about 42 kilograms per hectare. So 42 kilograms of pesticides per 2.5 acres, which is heavy. And so there's quite the cost to it, which sort of balances out that seeming wealth that's starting to come in. This, again, is the setting for our story, and I'll tell you just a little bit more here as we go about the realities. Because in the middle of the Finchgau Valley, this is the reality. This is what happens when everything is transitioned to apples. And I'll give you a little taste of this. And by way of this story, this is the Gluterer family. They're folks who've become really good friends of my family here over the last couple of years because they had an organic herb business. And what's fascinating is that Urban, who is the father, Urban decided that he wanted to change careers. He was working with mentally disabled adults. And part of what was happening in the process was they asked him if he would help them learn how to do certain kinds of farming. And so they started producing teas that they could grow, they could package, and then they could sell as part of the career development for these folks. And Urban just got really fascinated. And he realized, well, this is sort of an odd contrast because I have this orchard, which was conventionally managed, and I'm out there spraying, and here I am working by day, with all of these people and pushing all of the principles of organic. He said it just didn't feel like everything aligned very well. So he decided that maybe there was this business opportunity when he turned 40 in order to change things around and start an organic herb farm. So that's what he and his wife did. He did it with the help of his father and mother. When it was all said and done, which is right now, 4 generations started to contribute to putting together this organic herb farm. And it was awesome, and it was profitable, and it was working out. But then the apple orchards started to move in until it got to the point where they were entirely surrounded by apple orchards. And as a result of being entirely surrounded by apple orchards, they were dealing with pesticide drift, so that suddenly all of the crops that they were producing were tainted by this pesticide drift. And of course, they had to have things tested in order to be organic. And it got to be so bad that they decided, okay, well, maybe we can have these really tall hedgerows. So they had tall trees put in all around the farm. That didn't do it. Then they decided they would build what they call in German a water curtain. So they would shoot these kind of fans of water up all the way across, all the way around the perimeter. So 30 feet high on all sides whenever they started spraying. They'd turn on these water curtains so that they'd be spraying up and hopefully capturing the water or capturing the pesticides. And then those pesticides and the water would be taken elsewhere off site. That didn't do the trick. So at that point they said, all right, so we have a choice. We can either stay here and we can fight the system and try to find a way to actually live within it, or we can move. But if we surrender, then everybody else is going to surrender. And so they said, we're going to stick it out. So they invested, at that point, 250,000 euros. At that point in time, it was just over $300,000 to cover their entire farm in greenhouses. Everything except for a little piece of show garden, which was around the outside, which they can't use or sell anything from that because it's tainted with pesticides. They covered the entire thing with these high tunnels. And what that means is they are protected from pesticides, and they have to do the testing, and that's good, I suppose. But also, when it rains and the water comes down and it hits those high tunnels, that water has to be taken off-site because it's tainted with pesticides. That's how bad it is. When they're working inside, and I've taken student groups in at various times, when they're working inside, it can get up to over 120 degrees inside because of those. And so the last time I was there and talking to Urban and his son Manuel, they said our goal in 7 years is to be able to work in an environment that's not 120 degrees. We want to make sure that the policies around us change so that we get to the point where if there are going to be apple farms around us, they're going to be organic apple farms. And we can't keep doing this. So their business is very successful. They're really amazing folks, but they've also borne the brunt of a lot of enmity of people around them. And in part, perhaps, it's because they've done all these videos. They have the last time we talked, they had over 300 different videos of the pesticide spraying that's going on. This is taken from their house. You can start to get a sense of what's happening with the pesticides. This is something that is not unique to this area, and yet this area, because it's sort of a funnel, essentially, this valley, you have what people call in dialect the Finchgewind, the Finchgau wind, which sometimes blows for 2 to 3 weeks at a time. And if you're a farmer and you're trying to spray pesticides, typically every 7 to 14 days, that doesn't necessarily jibe. You also see the thermal updraft that you get here by virtue of being in a climate like this. And you also start to get a sense that, part of what we've done in pesticide development is we've actually created these aerosols. The idea is that we wanted to penetrate the foliage of the trees and the vines as extensively as possible. And to do that, you try to get the droplets as small as possible. So you create these aerosols, you're trying to blast it into the trees, but at the same time, this is what happens. Those aerosols can be lifted. So now what they're finding is, even at the lakes that are above 2,000 meters, they're finding pesticide residues there. So, we think we're fixing one thing in the pesticide industry, and it's just this constant treadmill of actually creating more problems for ourselves in so many cases. This all came about after about 2 years of groundwork being laid by the citizens of Maltz and trying to educate themselves about what the issues were with pesticides. So one of the key players, actually she and her husband, this is Edith, and Edith and her husband Robert retired to this area, which was where Robert grew up. They retired here, and they started collecting all of the old varieties of grains and vegetables that they could in the area. And people thought, well, maybe Robert and Edith, they're sort of doing their own thing. It's this hobby. It's, they're kind of eclectic. But what they ended up doing before it was popular, this started back in the 1990s, was they actually started saving these old grain varieties, finding them and saving them and putting them forward. In fact, there's a great story that I've got in the book where there was a neighbor who was taking the tile roof off of his house, and when he did it, he found a newspaper from the late 1800s, and in that newspaper, folded up, were 2 heads of grain, spelt as it turned out, which they actually then planted, and now that's been propagated by a lot of the farmers in the area as this old variety of spelt that they have. So, what everybody thought at one point was just something that was just kind of, the thing Robert and Edith did turned out to be something that was really critical. And here you have Robert, and Robert's quite a character, and as he tells the story, the only way for us to save our marriage is for us to have a division of labor, and the division of labor is the top of the soil. I take care of everything below ground. She takes care of everything above ground. And they're just these extraordinary folks, and you go, they have 6 different gardens. One of them is this display garden that you see here, which is just extraordinary when you walk around and you see the diversity, and obviously all managed organically. And then they also have different fields where they've got the different grain trials and other things going on around. And just this is their retirement. This is what they do. Yeah, so the question was, did they need to let the ground lay fallow for a couple of years and have the 3-year transition period for organic, which is required in most places. In this case, they were able to go to fields that had been managed organically, maybe not certified, but interestingly, one of the things that Robert does not like is liquid manure, that's spread on the fields. Because he said these old grains, they don't need this rich soil. In fact, that's when they have diseases and they have problems. He's not saying not to take care of the fertility, but he's saying to do it by means of compost and other things and not liquefied manure, because he said that actually hurts the soil biology and creates problems. So while they may have been managed organically, and he said in a lot of cases they just have to sort of let some of that nitrogen dissipate over time. Oh, oops, I'm sorry. And then you have folks like Edward and Helga here, who, Edward's family had been doing this forever, it seems, generations, growing these grains, but then they were realizing that these traditions were being lost. So Edward, you'll see him out in the field quite a bit, growing these different grains. Helga has decided that it's really critical to teach school children, farmers' wives, tourists, everyone she can, how to actually process the grains inside the house, and then also how to do the baking. And it's those kind of folks. It's the people that just retain these standards and these traditions that are so important in a story like this. And this is Conrad, whom I mentioned early on. And Conrad, I think, here just represents the fact we have to have the gadflies. We have to have the people who are out there pushing these ideas forward. And I think Conrad would probably call himself a social entrepreneur, someone who's helping people see the cohesiveness of all these different possibilities and how to bring together these different ideas. So we created this image, which I think for all of you is a really important one to think about. This is Alexander who's cutting his hay there. And what Douglas and I were trying to represent, there were over 100 pesticides that were being used in apple orchards and vineyards. And so we took as many as we could squeeze into this image, and we just put them all out there. Because there are cases in which a farmer will use between 25 and 35 different pesticides in one given orchard, one given vineyard throughout the course of a single year. And what I'd like to say is that I think we hear about IPM, Integrated Pest Management. There has been an attempt to reduce the resistance that tends to build up among insects and fungal diseases by virtue of spraying a lot of different things. But what we've done in the process is we've created this incredible cocktail, which, first of all, we don't even know what the individual pesticides are doing. Secondly, we don't know what the adjuvants are that are added to the pesticides. And thirdly, we sure as heck don't know what's going on in terms of the mixture of all these different elements. And so these are called the combinative effects of pesticides. And there are different kinds of interactions that can happen as these pesticides get mixed in among one another. One is it can be additive. Another is that things build on top of each other. Another is that you get a synergistic effect, that the two chemicals together actually start to do things that you never expected or certainly weren't intended. And the other is that they can actually be antagonistic, so that they're actually working against each other and creating some scenarios that are fairly dangerous. So, what's amazing to me and just astounding about the pesticide industry is we have the pesticides, that is the active ingredients themselves, and then those are regulated to some degree, but then you have basically the solutions or the additives that are there, the adjuvants that are there with them, often keeping them in suspension, for which there is no regulation. And in many cases, if you pick up a pesticide container, you look, the active ingredient will be between 1% and 5%. The rest of it is 95%, which in most cases is considered a trade secret. And if you have an issue where you have the toxicity issue, you call the Poison Control Center, then they may not have access to that trade secret. So it's not only the pesticides and the active ingredients, it's also these adjuvants, which now have, we've started to see different things pop up in those adjuvants that are actually, some scientists think are more dangerous than the active ingredients themselves. So this is what we're dealing with. This is just incredible cocktail. And in this case, we picked up on a saying that was used by one of the researchers here in the U.S., where he talks about the molecular bull in a china shop. And in this case, the Germans use elephant instead of bull. But it's just this molecular bull that's there. We don't even know what those bulls are in many cases as they're running around interacting with one another. And then there again, citizen science. There was a group of Germans working in one particular township. They've been documenting insect populations for over 30 years. I mean, that sounds kind of nerdy. Why would you do that? But I'm glad there was somebody doing it, because now they're seeing what's happening in terms of the decline. And those citizen scientists really sort of created the studies that have been the bellwether for us realizing that we're up against what some people are calling an insectageddon. This sixth species extinction is what some folks are calling it. But we're seeing a decline of 30, 40, 50% of insects in different places. And then as a result, as insect populations go down, it goes down the chain. Bird populations start to also decline. And part of this is, it's about leverage points. What do people care about? How do we talk to them? If they don't care about their food, do they care about the birds? Do they care about the kids and the schoolyards? What is it? I mean, I think we can usually find somewhere where people actually have a point of caring. And so it's important to figure out where that might be. And this really is about that mass extinction that we're thinking may be underway. You think about the windshield as you travel down the road, and the fact, there aren't the bugs on the windshield that there used to be. This just came out 3 or 4 days ago, I believe. Mayfly numbers dropped by half since 2012. Since 2012, the mayfly populations are so big. The way they've documented it is by virtue of the radar recordings that they have, in the upper Midwest. Because the mayflies, the numbers have been so big, they've been picked up on radar over time, and they've actually had to kind of weed that out, if you will, in terms of their understanding of what was going on weather-wise, and we're starting to see that decline happen there.